Well, thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm very pleased to be here. During the last quarter of a century, discourses of race and ethnicity in France have been characterized by a major paradox. At one level, with the exception of the extreme right, politicians of almost all shades of opinion and a very large part of the academic and research community have until recently been united in the view that race and ethnicity have no rightful place in public discourse. And yet, at another level, those same politicians, together with the mass media, have been deeply involved in the ethnicization, some would say the racialization, of French politics, which in turn is part of a much wider way in which many aspects of French society have become heavily ethnicized in recent decades. Now, in the last few years, the gap between official discourse and the day-to-day praxis of social relations has become increasingly difficult to conceal, and it has indeed narrowed. Politicians and researchers have become increasingly inclined to acknowledge that, like it or not, ethnicity is a significant factor in many aspects of French society, and, after hanging precariously in the balance, attempts to document the salience of ethnicity through new forms of data gathering appear now to have overcome the main obstacles placed in their way. My analysis of these developments falls into three main parts. The first of these looks at the new forms of ethnicity which have come to the fore in France in recent years. The second examines the reasons for resistance to the acknowledgement of ethnic differences, with particular reference to the role of the state in the construction of knowledge. And the third and final part looks at the gradual erosion of that resistance and recent moves which have now opened the doors to ethnic data gathering. So let me begin with the new forms of ethnicity which we've seen emerging in France in recent decades. In varying degrees and in different ways, ethnicity has, of course, always been a factor in French politics, but in recent decades, this has taken new forms, thrown up new debates, and generated new policy responses. During the first half of the 20th century, Jews were the main minority at issue in public debates, most obviously during the Dreyfus Affair at the beginning of the century, and later during the Nazi occupation of the 1940s, when the Vichy regime, the only regime in modern history to systematically incorporate the word race into its discourse, in modern French history, to systematically incorporate the word race into its discourse, the Vichy regime collaborated in the early 1940s in rounding up Jews who were to perish in the death camps. Now, one of the effects of the Holocaust was to fundamentally discredit discourses of biological racism, which were shown to be not only morally catastrophic, but also scientifically invalid. And because of its association with the Nazi and Vichy regimes, the word race became a taboo word in post-war France, making it virtually impossible for mainstream politicians to use that word. Since the war, and it's on the post-war period that I'm going to be focusing, there have also been important changes in the ethnic composition of France's minority populations, with the rise of post-colonial immigrant minorities originating principally in North Africa and other parts of France's former colonial empire. Until the 1960s, the overwhelming majority of immigrants in France had come from within Europe. Since then, the balance has tilted towards immigrants from outside Europe and, above all, from former French colonies in predominantly Islamic countries. Contrary to frequent claims that the Republic has always been implacably opposed to racism, the Republic, in fact, institutionalized racism, in all but name, throughout the colonial period. through systematic discrimination against indigenous peoples of the overseas territories over which it ruled. This is something which is conveniently forgotten by many of those who present themselves today as the guardians of Republican orthodoxy. In the post-colonial period, immigrant minorities within metropolitan France, originating in former colonies, have consistently suffered high levels of discrimination, albeit in less institutionalized ways than during the colonial period overseas. They have, for example, these post-colonial minorities within France have been, for example, the principal victims of unemployment, with jobless rates far higher than those of the national population as a whole. And yet they've been simultaneously scapegoated, not only as the causes of that unemployment, but also as threats to the integrity of French society and to the very foundations of French national identity. The growing preoccupation among the majority ethnic population with minorities that are now seen more frequently as Muslims, rather than as they were 20 or 30 years ago as immigrant workers, this preoccupation has been seen in its most hysterical forms to take on, for example, the shape of the Islamic headscarf affairs of 1989, 1994, and 2003 to 4. In media and political discourses, as well as in majority ethnic public opinion, those affairs have been widely misrepresented and misunderstood as signs of a fundamental unwillingness on the part of Muslim minorities to adapt to French social and cultural norms. In reality, there is a massive body of research data showing that minorities of Muslim heritage have overwhelmingly acculturated to French norms, including the code of laïcité, that is to say, the formal separation of organized religions from the Republic, separating organized religions on the one hand and the Republic on the other. These minorities of Muslim heritage also accept the conventional limitations on religious expression in public spaces, which are associated with laïcité. The essentializing of people of Muslim heritage, treating them as a monolithic and immutable bloc, as if they are only Muslims and can never be anything other than that, or can never adapt their way of being Muslim to the other aspects of living in French society. This very caricatural vision of them comes close in some ways to old-fashioned biological racism. It's a form of essentialism, treating cultural differences virtually as racial differences. These racialized differences are in fact social constructions rather than biological givens. Now, it was against this backdrop that the extreme right Front National made its first electoral breakthrough in 1983, trading on a radically anti-immigrant platform under the leadership of Jean-Marie Le Pen, one of the few French politicians to openly use and indeed trade upon the word race. He, for example, on one notable occasion, proclaimed very forcefully, "Yes, I do believe in the inequality of races," which generated the kind of media controversy in which he revels because it attracts lots of attention for him. Since 1983, the Front National has enjoyed the longest sustained electoral successes of any extreme right party in Western Europe, scoring between 10 and 18% of the vote at every parliamentary and presidential election until 2007, when it slipped to below 5% for the first time since 1984, in the parliamentary elections, which in 2007 followed the election of Nicolas Sarkozy as president. Far from betokening a reduction in the political salience of issues relating to ethnicity, Sarkozy's triumph in 2007 is just the latest in a long series of events reflecting the contaminating effects of the Front National on French politics as a whole. For in the face of the Front National's electoral threat, politicians in most of the major established parties, not only on the centre-right, very obviously Sarkozy, but also on the left, have for the last 25 years trimmed and tweaked their discourses and policies in ways designed to woo ethnically prejudiced voters. A notable example of this was the reform of French nationality laws, with the aim of excluding second and third generation members of minority groups from automatic access to French citizenship. First proposed by the Front National in the early 1980s, the idea was taken up by the centre-right, then led by Jacques Chirac, who attempted unsuccessfully to push it through Parliament while serving as Prime Minister in the late 1980s. The measure passed into law in 1993 under the centre-right government of Edouard Balladur and was then rescinded when the left returned to office in 1997. After regaining power in 2002, the centre-right implemented a slew of measures which had initially been proposed by the Front National to combat what in France is called insécurité, anxieties about law and order associated in the popular imagination with immigrant minorities. And much of that work, much of those measures against insécurité, much of those measures were the work of the then Interior Minister, Nicolas Sarkozy, who in his presidential election campaign openly courted Front National voters, notoriously, for example, in a February 2007 TV appearance, in the course of which he vowed that he would ensure that Muslims would not be allowed to slaughter sheep in their bathtubs, recycling a crudely Islamophobic myth, urban myth, that bears no reality to the everyday lives of Muslims. The success of Sarkozy in taking votes from Le Pen through tactics such as this was manifest in exit polls conducted after the first round of voting in April 2007, which showed that many former supporters of Le Pen had switched to Sarkozy. If the ethnicization of French politics has been plain to see, politicians have nevertheless spent a lot of time denying the salience of ethnicity as a factor in social behaviour. And here I move on to the second part of my remarks. Until quite recently, most politicians denied, for example, that ethnic discrimination was a sufficiently serious problem to merit their attention. As racial and ethnic discrimination were formally prohibited by the French Constitution and by a law passed in 1972, it was frequently contended that the matter had been dealt with. But we've got a law. What else do you want? We've dealt with it. We've passed a law. Reminds me of one of my favourite road signs back in the 1960s and 1970s in France. You don't see them now. But used to drive along on some of these small roads and it would say, chaussée déformée sur 20 kilomètres, which meant bad road ahead for the next 20 kilometres, which was kind of, we dealt with the problem. We put a sign up, but we didn't actually repair the road. So, if you like, this was, I think, my way of looking at the fact that the Constitution and the law and so on and so forth, we've dealt with the problem. The tiny number of court convictions secured on the grounds of discrimination was seen not, as it should have been seen, as a sign of lax enforcement, but as proof that racism was a minor problem. When, in the second half of the 1990s, the evidence of discrimination collected by sociologists and by pressure groups became so overwhelming that the existence of widespread discrimination could no longer be denied, the barricades of denial were then re-erected around the question of ethnically based data collection. Nationality, until quite recently the only ethnic marker in most publicly available census data in France, though of course nationality is never referred to in France as being an ethnic category. Think about that one if you wish. Nationality distinguishes foreigners from French nationals. And that's, as I say, it's really been the only criterion used in most French census data, which we would recognize as an ethnic marker until very recently. Now, as about a third of all immigrants and virtually all the descendants of immigrants are French citizens, they are, by the same token, invisible in most official statistics, which only distinguish between French citizens and non-citizens. And as ethnic discrimination operates on the basis of colour or culture, rather than on the basis of formal citizenship, its effects are also statistically invisible. In refusing to collect data based on racial or ethno-cultural categories, the Republic has allowed discrimination to remain beyond the reach of the standards of evidence which are required for successful prosecutions. Convictions, court convictions, generally require evidence of direct discrimination. That is to say, proof of a statement showing that the defendant treated an individual unfairly for explicitly racial or ethnic reasons. And of course, knowing this, racists have become adept at camouflaging their motives, thereby escaping prosecution. Indirect discrimination, in which individuals or institutions engage in behaviour which, intentionally or not, and in some cases it may be quite unintentional, has the effect of treating members of certain groups unfairly, has recently become an offence in French law, in line with a European Union directive mandating this. But as indirect discrimination cannot be proved without institutional data gathering, this new legal tool remains largely a dead letter in the absence of data based on ethnic categories other than nationality. Despite this statistical and juridical occultation, the effects of discrimination are all too apparent. In the early 1990s, when the unemployment rate was around 10% for the nation as a whole, with youth unemployment running at about 20% for the nation as a whole, a trailblazing ethnically based survey found that unemployment among young people of Algerian origin was running at about 40%, 40%, in the early 1990s. And a further survey conducted at the end of the 1990s found that the unemployment rate amongst young ethnic Algerians is running at about 50%. There was not, and still is not, a single député member of North African origin or of Muslim heritage in the 577-seat National Assembly. Not one single person of North African or Muslim heritage. Minorities are also visibly underrepresented in the French media. This was clearly documented in 1999, for example, when Hervé Bourges, head of the Conseil supérieur de l'audiovisuel, the regulatory agency responsible for overseeing French television and radio, was persuaded to commission a study entitled "The Presence and Representation of Visible Minorities on French Television," unquote, which computed the proportional presence of, and these categories were used in 1999 for the first time in a publicly funded survey, it computed the proportional presence of blacks, Arabs/North Africans, and Asians in relation to the other, which of course implicitly meant white or European faces seen on French TV. Now, when the preliminary results of that research were published in June 2000, the outcry by politicians and journalists against the use of racial and ethnic categories, but not against the underrepresentation which they revealed, but against the use of the ethnic and racial categories, was so huge that the Conseil supérieur de l'audiovisuel cancelled the publication of the full report, of which I do have a copy. Most of the arguments against ethnic data gathering are couched in a discourse of Republican principles. And I should say, coming as I do, as you may have guessed by now, I'm not American by origin. Coming from a constitutional monarchy, I am a strong believer in Republican principles. So what we need to understand here is that the people who present themselves as the guardians of Republican orthodoxy are simply hijacking, in my view, this word Republican for a particular ideology, which in my view is far from having a monopoly on what might be legitimately regarded as fidelity to the values of the Republic. Most of the arguments against ethnic data gathering are couched in a discourse of Republican principles. You can't do that because it's against Republican principles. This is what you hear over and over again. These Republican principles, on this reading of those principles, are held to be incompatible with the public acknowledgement of ethnic differences. Now, two main lines of argument advanced in this way point on the one hand to the sinister purposes to which ethnic data were put during the Vichy period, and on the other hand to the alleged dangers of weakening national cohesion inherent in using categories that might fuel what the French call communautarisme, that is to say, divisive forms of ethnic consciousness. The authoritarian Vichy regime, which broke radically with the Third Republic, remains a deeply troubling episode in French history, not simply because the French government presided over Marshal Pétain collaborated with Nazi Germany, but more specifically because it pursued a policy of anti-Semitism, which resulted in tens of thousands of Jews being rounded up and deported to death camps. And those deportations were facilitated by the compilation of registers of Jews by officials in the Vichy government. Opponents of ethnic data gathering frequently confuse, or perhaps sometimes deliberately misrepresent, modern, anonymized databases as if these were synonymous with ethnically categorized records of individual persons, and claim that the compilation of such data is motivated by, or at the very least open to, misuse against vulnerable groups, and therefore must not be pursued, must not be allowed. On this logic, ethnic data gathering is incompatible with Republican governance, for it threatens to lead to a police state, as in the US, obviously. That was a joke. Or in the UK, another well-known police state. So ethnic data gathering is incompatible with Republican governance, for it threatens to lead to a police state and to the persecution of minorities. So that's one argument. The second argument made against ethnic data gathering, or the second main argument, claims that the Republic recognizes only individuals, not groups, and would be betraying a fundamental principle if it were to recognize differences between ethnic groups. Now, I think there's some deliberate playing on ambiguity in what we understand by the word recognition, which I haven't got time to work through right now. But let me just note that in reality, the Republic recognizes and officially dialogues with numerous groups, institutionalized groups, from trades unions and employers' organizations to churches and other religious bodies. Those who, in opposing ethnic data gathering, present themselves as the guardians of self-evident republican principles are in reality arguing for a particular version of republicanism constructed in the context of post-colonial migration from mainly Muslim countries, which many of those guardians of republican orthodoxy believe cannot be assimilated into mainstream French society. Within this optic, Muslims are fundamentally at odds with a further key principle of the Republic, laïcité, and they are implacably inclined towards communautarisme, ethnic sectarianism, which, if given the apparent backing of ethnically based data collection, would lead to French society splitting between rival ethnic communities. For example, when the earliest of these kinds of debates began back in the 1980s, there was much talk about la libanisation de la France. France was threatened with Lebanization, being divided into warring ethnic communities. Now, proponents of both of these arguments prioritize theoretical dangers which would allegedly flow from ethnic data collection, relegating concerns over actual discrimination to a secondary level. Not uncommonly, they claim, without, of course, any empirical evidence to back this claim, since their near stranglehold on the institutions of the Republic has made collection of such evidence impossible, but not infrequently, they claim that the purity of the nation's republican principles has saved France from the levels of discrimination seen in other countries. In its most extreme forms, this kind of argument suggests that inquiries supposedly designed to measure racism actually generate racism. So if you talk about it, you create it. A fierce battle has raged, for example, over an annual opinion survey commissioned by the Commission nationale consultative des droits de l'homme, which since 1990 has been charged by the government with publishing an annual report on racism in France and measures designed to combat it. Every year, most respondents questioned in the survey have declared themselves to be in some degree racist. It's a very interesting finding. When this thing was originally started in 1990, the pollsters said there's no point asking that question because nobody's going to admit they're racist today. Most people, in fact, admit that they are in some degree racist. And they've been doing that every year since 1990 in this annual survey of opinion. In response to these findings, some members of the CNCDH's governing body have in recent years claimed that the survey itself is generating racism by asking such questions and should therefore be discontinued. Wonderful back-to-front logic, this, isn't it? Yeah? Where the existence of discrimination is acknowledged, existing tools are said to be sufficient to deal with it. It's also frequently asserted, again without any empirical evidence, that ethnic data gathering would be a Trojan horse, leading inevitably to policies of positive discrimination, French nomenclature for US-style affirmative action, and ethnic quotas, which would instill ethnic strife in place of the ethnic harmony which we see, of course, every day on the streets of France. This kind of argument is often advanced in France by an appeal to anti-Americanism. During the post-war period, there's been a long tradition of French statesmen trying to offset the global domination of the United States by insisting on a specifically French way of doing things. The French exception, n'est-ce pas? In French debates over immigration and integration policies, during the last 25 years, the United States has frequently been cited as an anti-model, an example of the dreadful consequences which would follow if France were to follow so-called Anglo-Saxon policies in relation to ethnic matters. Policies such as affirmative action and ethnic monitoring, ethnic data collection, introduced in the US to combat discrimination, are in France often blamed for producing the problems they were designed to remedy. Racial discrimination, ethnic segregation, urban ghettos, etc. These have all been produced by US affirmative action policies. I'm glad you understand your country better now on the basis of these enlightened views that I'm bringing to you from across the Atlantic. And so through this back-to-front logic, it has frequently been asserted that France can avoid the development of comparable problems only by refusing to follow the policies which allegedly produce them. Now, the trouble with this seemingly noble vision of French Republican principles, somewhere, up there, is that in failing to address the realities of everyday discrimination, somewhere at street level, in many, many parts of French society, that this view of French Republican principles allows that discrimination at street level to go unchecked, breeding precisely the kinds of social divisions against which opponents of ethnic data gathering warn. In other words, the refusal to collect ethnic data deprives the Republic of an important tool with which to enforce, as distinct from merely incanting, the principle of equality for all before the law. Until a few years ago, as I've said, the question of ethnic data gathering was almost completely taboo in French public debate. To even raise the matter was to immediately invite condemnation on the grounds of alleged anti-republicanism and or the promotion of alien Anglo-Saxon ideas. But gradually, doors towards ethnic data gathering have been opening as part of a wider recognition of the need for more forceful action against discrimination. So here I come now to the final part of my talk, in which I'll look at some of the factors which have pushed ethnic data gathering up the political agenda to the point where it now appears to be an unstoppable momentum. By the late 1990s, a growing body of evidence collected in studies by sociologists such as Michel Tribalat and Philippe Bataille, together with tests conducted by pressure groups such as SOS Racisme, made it increasingly difficult to deny the existence of widespread discrimination. So the evidence was really becoming incontrovertible. Further, in parallel with this accumulation of evidence, the victims of discrimination were becoming increasingly restive. Post-colonial immigrant minorities are concentrated mainly in disadvantaged urban areas known as the banlieue, which have been the scene of a steady stream of confrontations between minority ethnic youths and the police. The most widespread of these confrontations were, of course, the riots of 2005, which forced the government to declare a state of emergency. But at a lower level of intensity, similar disturbances, typically involving attacks on the police, the burning of cars and public buildings, in response to police methods which are seen as emblematic of a discriminatory social order. Disturbances of that time have been flaring up periodically in the banlieue since the late 1970s, to the point where by the mid-1990s, and I think the film La Haine, released in 1995, was an emblematic moment in this, there were serious concerns that threats to public order in these urban areas might spin out of control if nothing were done to pacify young victims of discrimination. But it was not until 2005, June 2005, that the centre-right president, Jacques Chirac, inaugurated the Haute Autorité de lutte contre les discriminations et pour l'égalité, the HALDE, whose mission it is to assist victims of discrimination, thus bringing France into compliance with the 1997 Amsterdam Treaty. But that move in 2005, setting up the HALDE, came too late to avert the eruption of the banlieue just a few months later, in late October 2005. Moreover, Chirac remained implacably opposed to the collection of ethnically based statistics, as did his Prime Minister, Dominique de Villepin, and as did, for that matter, the head of the HALDE, Louis Schweitzer. They were all opposed to the collection of ethnically based data. And in the absence of that, institutional and indirect discrimination would continue to go largely unchecked. There thus remained an unresolved tension between changes in public discourse, seemingly becoming more ready to recognize the existence of discrimination, to attempt to fight it on the one hand, and on the other hand, the policies which would be necessary to do that effectively, which would include some measurement of ethnic differences and the effects of ethnic differences in various aspects of French societies. The political impetus, which now appears to have unlocked the door to ethnic data gathering, has come from what may in many ways seem an unlikely quarter, Nicolas Sarkozy. In pursuit of his presidential ambitions, which came to fruition when he beat the socialist candidate, Ségolène Royal, in the second round of voting in May 2007, Sarkozy proved himself a master of promising something to virtually every part of the electorate, no matter how at odds with each other those segments might be, nor how seemingly contradictory his promises might be. Most uncharacteristic of politicians, of course. That was a joke. While serving as Interior Minister in the run-up to the presidential elections, he courted with great success voters on the extreme right by trading on Islamophobic stereotypes. I mentioned one of those earlier. And by dismissing disruptive youths in the banlieue as racailles, scum, a remark which was very germane to the riots of 2005. His refusal to retract that word was highly inflammatory and undoubtedly helped to stoke the riots of 2005. Now, that Nicolas Sarkozy, trading on Islamophobia, stirring up trouble, it has to be said, in the banlieue, in 2005, that was the same Nicolas Sarkozy who in 2003 had broken ranks and become the first senior politician in France to call for the seemingly unspeakable by advocating, quote-unquote, positive discrimination. This was the same Nicolas Sarkozy who prided himself and scandalized others, including Jacques Chirac, in announcing the appointment of a Muslim prefect, representative of the central government at county level, thereby helping to rectify the underrepresentation of minorities in the senior echelons of the French civil service. This was the same Nicolas Sarkozy who opposed Jacques Chirac's 2004 law banning the Islamic headscarf in French public schools. This delectation in political opportunism continued after Sarkozy's election as president. In his election campaign, he promised to set up a new ministry for immigration and national identity, brazenly pandering to those, especially on the right of the political spectrum, who saw immigration as a threat to national identity. In the legislation introduced after the elections by the man appointed to head that new ministry, Sarkozy's right-hand man, Brice Hortefeux, a whole raft of new measures designed to curb immigration were introduced, including language tests and highly controversial DNA tests. But those stood cheek by jowl in the same legislation with an amendment to the 1978 Data Protection Law designed to authorize the collection of data. This amendment in 2007 was designed to authorize the collection of data for the purposes of, quote, measuring diversity of origins, discrimination, and integration. So this was, without using the word ethnic, this was going to be the legalization of ethnic data gathering in France, proposed through legislation in 2007. This amendment, which its proponents had openly stated was aimed at legalizing data gathering based on racial and ethnic categories, was immediately challenged by old-style guardians of Republican rhetoric who asked the Constitutional Council to declare the new law void. Now, while their efforts appeared initially to prevail in the fall of 2007, it has now, in recent months, become clear that they have lost the battle to block the collection of ethnically based data. In January 2008, Sarkozy announced that he wanted to inscribe the principle of diversity in the preamble to the Constitution, and that he was setting up a commission headed by former centrist minister Simon Veil to advise on how this and other constitutional changes might be made. Although Sarkozy did not explicitly say that he wanted to use such a revision to facilitate ethnic data gathering or positive discrimination in favour of minority groups, it was widely assumed that the proposed constitutional amendment foreshadowed steps of that nature. It wasn't until December 2008 that the Veil Commission delivered its report, initially promised for much earlier in the year. The report recommended firmly against the constitutional revision for which Sarkozy had called, and against policies of ethnically based positive discrimination for which such a revision might have paved the way. While those negative recommendations grabbed the headlines, the small print of the Veil report noted with approval that on a separate but closely related matter, the path had in fact been recently cleared for the collection of ethnically based data without the need for a constitutional revision, thanks to a clarification which had been discreetly issued by the Constitutional Council in February 2008. This clarification is one of my all-time favourites. It was done on the website by just adding an extra sentence. And if you consulted the website after that particular date, you would never find the earlier clarification before the clarification was reclarified to what it presently says. In noting the Constitutional Council's reclarification, the Veil Commission said that existing constitutional provisions made it possible to collect data, and I quote, that can be read in a fashion comparable to that of an ethno-racial system of categories. And the Veil Commission noted this with approval. Far from opposing it, the Commission unequivocally supported the collection of ethnic statistics, which it said were essential in the fight against discrimination. Its recommendation against a constitutional revision enshrining the principle of diversity was thus grounded not in opposition to ethnic statistics, but in the observation that the collection of such data was already permitted by the Constitution, and therefore no constitutional revision was necessary. Now, those subtleties attracted far less media attention than the Commission's recommendations against a constitutional commitment to diversity and the prospect of ethnically based policies of positive discrimination. Sarkozy, after the Veil Commission report was published, Sarkozy delivered a high-profile speech in which he accepted that ethnically based policies of ethnic discrimination should not be pursued. He argued that instead policies of positive discrimination based on social disadvantage, which of course long been pursued by the Republic, should be further strengthened. And he argued that in pursuing measures of positive discrimination in favour of the socially disadvantaged, this would de facto help many of minority ethnic origin because, of course, minority ethnic groups tend to be concentrated among socially disadvantaged groups. At the same time, Sarkozy insisted on the need for collecting statistics on diversity, by which he meant ethnic diversity. And although he said that data collected of this nature, quote, must not present an ethnic reading of our society, unquote, his insistence on the need for, quote, statistics to measure inequality and discrimination linked to people's origins, unquote, clearly amounted in practice to support for ethnically based statistics in all but name. So he was crossing here a bridge which had been quietly crossed by the Veil Commission in its small print a few months before that, a bridge which in turn the Constitutional Council had crossed by this discreet reclarification of its initial clarification on the website that you can no longer even see as having taken place because, you know, there's the clarification and we always meant that, didn't we really? So it's this kind of very surreptitious, incremental movement which has got us to the point where the way for ethnic data gathering is now, I think, clearly open. In the absence, however, of policy initiatives based directly on ethnic criteria, what Sarkozy and others would call positive discrimination based on ethnic criteria, it remains to be seen how more broadly based policies addressing socially disadvantaged groups, defined, for example, in terms of personal income or residential concentrations of poverty, it remains to be seen how far policy measures targeting those groups will rectify the specific forms of inequality which result from racial and ethnic discrimination. Whatever the outcome of these colourblind policies, there is now, that said, a much clearer prospect of measuring ethnically based inequality and discrimination together with such progress as may or may not be made in curbing discrimination. Now, in conclusion, among the many ironies which have punctuated the bumpy road towards the public recognition of ethnicity in France is the fact that the left, generally more sympathetic than the right towards minority groups, has been dominated by a Socialist Party leadership hostile to data gathering designed to help combat discrimination, while the right, frequently inclined to scapegoat immigrants for electoral purposes, has, under Sarkozy, appeared far more willing than the left to embrace not only ethnic data gathering but also positive discrimination in favour of minority groups. Of course, much depends on what is meant by positive discrimination and the modus operandi of data gathering on diversity, which will, I think, remain lightly camouflaged compared with that seen in the UK or the US, where openly racial and ethnic categories are a routine part of nationwide censuses. But after a roller coaster ride in which those pressing for ethnic data gathering seemed to have reached a constitutional impasse, the road towards a clearer understanding of the role of ethnicity in French society does now appear to be open. Thank you.